I am 71 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I received a message from something that isn't supposed to exist. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a phone call. It was a pattern of stones arranged outside my cabin door, a pattern I hadn't seen in over 30 years, a pattern that only one creature on Earth knew how to make. His name was Marcus. That's what I called him when he was small enough to hold in my arms, when he still made that chirping sound instead of the deep resonant calls he'd later develop, when he looked at me with those amber eyes and saw something other than a threat. I found him in the spring of 1989. I raised him until 1994. And then he left, vanishing into the Cascade wilderness like smoke dissolving into morning fog. I never expected to hear from him again, but the forest remembers. The forest keeps records we don't understand, and apparently, after 3 decades of silence, the forest has decided it's time for Marcus to come home. This is the story I've never told anyone. Not my ex-wife, not my daughter, not the therapists who tried to help me process what they assumed was grief-induced delusion. This is real, every word of it, and I'm only telling it now because I think Marcus needs me to. Let me take you back to who I was before any of this happened. My name is Thomas Carver. In 1989, I was 35 years old and recently divorced. My wife had left me for reasons that seemed incomprehensible at the time, but made perfect sense in retrospect. I was obsessed with the wilderness, not in a healthy weekend hiking way, in a way that consumed everything else. I'd purchased 200 acres of remote forest land in the North Cascades of Washington state. The property was 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a logging trail that became impassable 6 months of the year. I'd built a cabin there with my own hands, solar panels, rain collection, a root cellar. I was preparing for something, though I couldn't have told you what. My ex-wife called it running away. My therapist called it isolation behavior. I called it finally finding peace. The property bordered federal wilderness. Beyond my fence line stretched 3 million acres of protected forest, one of the largest roadless areas in the lower 48 states. Wolves had returned to that land. Grizzlies were making their way down from Canada. Things lived in those mountains that biologists were still discovering. But I never imagined what I'd find on the morning of April 14th, 1989. I was checking my eastern property line, looking for signs of the elk herd that migrated through each spring. The snow had only recently melted at that elevation. Patches of white still clung to the shadows beneath the old-growth cedars. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't a cry exactly. It was something between a whimper and a vocalization, something that raised every hair on my arms despite the fact that I couldn't identify it. I followed the sound for nearly half a mile, moving slowly, scanning for predators. What I found instead was something that still doesn't make sense, even after all these years. A pit, man-made, judging by the straight edges, perhaps 15 feet deep, lined with sharpened stakes at the bottom. An illegal trap of the worst kind, designed to capture something large. And at the bottom, impaled on one of those stakes, was a creature I'd never seen before. She was massive, 8 feet tall at least, covered in reddish-brown hair matted with blood. Her chest had been pierced clean through, and she wasn't moving. Hadn't been for hours, maybe longer, judging by the stiffness of her limbs. But that's not what made me freeze. Pressed against her body, making that whimpering sound, was a smaller creature. Infant-sized, maybe 30 pounds, covered in softer fur the color of autumn leaves. It looked up at me with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much awareness. It was a baby Sasquatch, and its mother had died, protecting it from whatever trap this was. Here's what I know for certain. Someone had dug that pit deliberately. The engineering was too precise for coincidence. The stakes were sharpened with tools, and the location, deep in wilderness but still accessible, suggested someone who knew this terrain intimately. Here's what remains a theory. Whoever set that trap was hunting Bigfoot specifically. They knew these creatures existed. They knew their migration patterns, and they'd constructed a killing pit designed for something of enormous size and weight. Here's what I still don't understand. Why didn't they come back? The trap had worked. They'd killed an adult female, yet the pit remained undisturbed, the body unrecovered, the infant left to starve beside its dead mother. Something had scared them away. Something had made them abandon their prize. I didn't think about any of this at the time. My mind was locked on the creature staring up at me from that pit, on the fact that it would die if I left it there, on the choice I was about to make. I climbed down into that pit, carefully, avoiding the stakes. The infant pressed itself against its mother's body, terrified of me, too weak to flee. Up close, I could see wounds on its small body, scratches, a gash on its shoulder that had partially clotted. It had tried to climb out. Multiple times from the look of the claw marks on the pit walls. It had failed every time. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said quietly. My voice felt absurd in that moment. What was I doing, talking to a mythological creature? But the infant's eyes tracked my words. Its head tilted slightly, and some of the tension left its small body. It understood. Not the specific words, maybe, but the intent, the tone. I reached out slowly. It flinched, but didn't flee. My hand touched its shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, feeling the trembling. "I know," I whispered. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too." I picked it up. It weighed less than I expected, all bones and fur and that strange warmth. It made a sound against my chest, something between a sigh and a sob. I climbed out of that pit with the infant clutched against me. I didn't look back at the mother. I couldn't, and I carried that creature half a mile through the forest to my cabin, knowing that my life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. The first week was survival, pure and simple. The infant, I started calling him Marcus on day 3, was severely dehydrated and malnourished. I didn't know what Sasquatch ate. I didn't know their physiology. I was working blind, operating on instinct and desperation. I tried water first. He drank eagerly, almost choking in his haste. Then goat's milk, which I'd stocked for coffee and cooking. He took to it immediately, drinking until his small belly distended. Food was trickier. I offered raw fish. He sniffed it and turned away. Cooked fish got the same response. Berries were accepted but didn't seem to satisfy. On day 4, I tried raw venison from a deer I'd shot the previous fall. Marcus devoured it. Not just ate, devoured. His small hands grabbed chunks and stuffed them into his mouth with an urgency that was almost violent. He ate until there was nothing left, then looked at me with those amber eyes asking for more. Primarily carnivorous then, at least at this age. I spent that first week doing nothing but caring for him, feeding, cleaning the wounds that covered his small body, keeping him warm at night when he shivered despite his fur. He slept in a nest of blankets beside my bed, and I barely slept at all, checking on him constantly. By day 8, he was strong enough to walk. By day 10, he was following me around the cabin like a shadow. And by day 14, something happened that changed everything I thought I understood about these creatures. I was sitting at my table, writing in my journal, trying to document everything I could observe. Marcus was on the floor nearby, playing with a wooden spoon I'd given him. Suddenly, he stood up, walked over to me, and placed his small hand on my knee. I looked down. He was staring at my journal, at the marks I was making on the paper. Then he picked up a pencil I'd left on the table, held it in his small fist, and made a mark on the paper, just a line, a simple vertical stroke. But he looked at it, then looked at me, then made another mark. He was trying to imitate writing. At 2 weeks old, or whatever his equivalent age was, this creature had observed human behavior, understood its basic purpose, and attempted to replicate it. I set down my pen. My hands were shaking. "What are you?" I whispered. Marcus just tilted his head and made that chirping sound. But his eyes, God, his eyes held something that looked disturbingly like curiosity. The months that followed were an education I never expected. Marcus grew at an astonishing rate. By June, he doubled in size. By August, he was nearly 4 feet tall and strong enough to lift logs I could barely roll. His intelligence developed even faster. I taught him words, not speech. His vocal anatomy couldn't produce human sounds, but understanding. I'd point at objects and name them repeatedly. Water, food, fire, tree, sky. Within 3 months, he knew over 50 words. By 6 months, he was combining them. pointing at the window when it rained and making his chirping sound while looking at me. Water, sky. Water, sky. Rain, I told him. That's called rain. He processed this, filed it away, never forgot it, but the words were only the beginning. Marcus understood cause and effect in ways that shocked me. He watched me start a fire once, then later attempted to replicate the process himself, gathering kindling and arranging it correctly before realizing he couldn't produce the spark. He observed me filtering water and began doing the same thing independently, using cloth I'd discarded. By his first year with me, Marcus was actively participating in cabin maintenance, carrying firewood, sorting stored food, even attempting to repair a fence post I'd complained about. He wasn't just learning, he was problem-solving, anticipating needs, thinking. The scientific implications were staggering. If Marcus was typical of his species, then Sasquatch weren't merely intelligent animals, they were something else entirely. A parallel line of cognitive evolution. A people hidden in the forests for thousands of years. But here's the part that still disturbs me. Marcus was learning too fast. I've read about child development since then. Human children don't develop this quickly. Even the most gifted prodigies don't absorb information at the rate Marcus did. His learning curve wasn't just impressive, it was impossible. Unless something else was happening. Unless Marcus was accessing knowledge through means I didn't understand. Unless the information was already there, dormant, waiting to be activated. I started noticing patterns in his behavior that supported this theory. He'd sometimes make gestures I'd never taught him. Complex gestures with specific meanings. Hand to heart meant gratitude. Both hands raised meant warning. A particular tap on the ground meant listen. Where had he learned these? His mother had died when he was an infant. He'd spent his entire conscious life with me. But the gestures weren't random, they were systematic, part of a language that predated our relationship. Marcus came to me with knowledge already embedded in his mind, instincts that were really inherited memories, a cultural framework encoded in his very genetics. And I was only scratching the surface of what that meant. Let me tell you about the night the others came. It was October 1990. Marcus had been with me for 18 months. He was nearly 5 feet tall now, his fur darkening from autumn leaf to deep chestnut. He'd lost the baby chirping sound and developed a range of vocalizations that I'd learned to interpret. We had our routines. Breakfast at dawn, work during the day, me on cabin projects, Marcus on whatever task he'd assigned himself. Evenings were for learning. I'd read to him, showing him pictures and books, explaining concepts he'd never encounter in the wild. He was fascinated by space, by the idea that the lights in the sky were other suns. He'd stare at astronomy pictures for hours, making soft sounds of wonder. That October night, I was reading to him about the moon, explaining eclipses. He was sitting beside me, completely absorbed. Then he went rigid. Every muscle in his body tensed, his head snapped toward the window, and he made a sound I'd never heard before. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Marcus? What is it?" He stood, moved to the window. His eyes were fixed on the tree line beyond my property. I grabbed my rifle and joined him. In the fading twilight, I could see the forest, the dark mass of cedars, the shadows between them. And then I saw movement, not one shape, several, large shapes moving between the trees with a grace that seemed impossible for their size. They were watching the cabin. They were watching Marcus. "Stay here," I whispered, reaching for the door. Marcus grabbed my arm. His grip was strong enough to leave bruises, though he didn't mean to hurt me. He shook his head violently. "I need to see who they are." He made a sound, urgent, frightened. And then I understood. He wasn't afraid of the shapes in the forest. He was afraid of what would happen if they saw me. We stood at that window for 3 hours, watching the shapes watch us. They never approached, never made sounds I could hear. But they were there, studying the cabin where one of their young had been living with a human. Just before midnight, Marcus made a decision. He walked to the door, opened it, stepped outside into the cold October air, and he called to them. The sound that came from his throat was unlike anything he'd produced before, It wasn't a word or a signal, it was a conversation, a complex pattern of tones and rhythms that carried meaning I couldn't decipher. The forest responded. Multiple voices answered him, different pitches, different patterns, a language older than any human tongue, spoken in the darkness between ancient trees. They talked for nearly an hour, Marcus standing on my porch, the others invisible in the shadows, back and forth, question and response, then silence. Marcus turned and came back inside, closed the door, looked at me with those amber eyes that had learned so much in 18 months. And he made the gesture for family, then pointed at himself, then pointed at the forest. They'd found him, his people, his tribe, whatever they were, and they wanted him back. Here's what Marcus communicated to me over the following days, using our limited shared language. The shapes in the forest were part of a group, a clan, I suppose you could call it. They'd been searching for the female who'd fallen into that pit, searching for her offspring. For over a year, they'd tracked scent trails that went cold, followed rumors that led nowhere, until they found Marcus's scent at the edge of my property. They hadn't approached immediately. They'd watched. For weeks, maybe months before that October night, they'd observed Marcus living with a human, learning human ways, becoming something neither fully Sasquatch nor fully integrated with his own kind. The debate among them had been intense. Marcus conveyed this through gestures and sounds and expressions I'd learned to read. Some wanted to take him immediately. Others argued he was contaminated. Still others were simply curious about the human who'd saved one of their young. The female who'd died, Marcus eventually communicated, had been important, a leader of some kind. Her death had created a vacuum in their social structure, and her offspring, her only offspring, carried significance beyond what I could understand. They wanted Marcus back, but they were willing to wait, to let him choose. This is the part that haunts me most. They gave him a choice. These creatures that the world insists are animals, that science refuses to acknowledge, that governments have spent decades denying. They gave a 2-year-old the autonomy to decide his own future. Because that's what Marcus was, developmentally. Approximately 2 years old by their species standards, barely past infancy. And they trusted him to make the right decision. Marcus stayed with me for 3 more years. 3 years of watching him grow into something remarkable, something caught between 2 worlds. He'd leave the cabin at night, sometimes for hours, meeting with the others at the edge of my property, learning things I couldn't teach him, recovering the heritage that the pit trap had nearly stolen. But he'd always come back. Every morning, he'd be there when I woke up, making breakfast sometimes, organizing supplies, continuing the routines we'd established. We developed a deeper communication during this period. Marcus was learning from both directions now, and his ability to convey complex concepts grew exponentially. He'd draw pictures in the dirt to explain things he couldn't gesture. He'd arrange objects to represent ideas. What he showed me changed everything I thought I knew about these creatures. They had history, oral traditions passed down through generations, stories about their origins, about their relationship with humans, about the long retreat into wilderness that had defined their existence for thousands of years. According to Marcus, his kind had once lived alongside humans, not in cities or villages, but in the spaces between. The deep forests, the mountain valleys, the places humans rarely ventured. There had been contact, trade even, mutual respect. Then something changed. Marcus couldn't explain what exactly. The stories were old, worn smooth by countless retellings. But humans had become dangerous, had started hunting his people, not for food, not for territory, for something else, something his kind possessed that humans wanted. I pressed him on this. What did humans want? What could his people offer that would justify such violence? Marcus would only make one gesture in response. He'd tap his forehead. Then point at the forest. Then make the sign for connection. His people had something humans had lost, some ability, some awareness, a connection to the natural world that went beyond anything I could comprehend. And humans had tried to take it by force. The genocide, if that's the right word, had driven his people into hiding, deep into the wilderness, into the places where humans couldn't follow. They'd learned to be invisible, to leave no traces, to watch without being watched. For thousands of years, they'd survived by remaining myth. And now here was Marcus, living with a human, bridging a gap that his people had maintained for millennia. Some of the others saw him as a traitor, a contamination, a risk to everything they'd built. Others saw him as something else entirely, a possibility. The dreams started in my third year with Marcus. I don't know what else to call them. They came at night, but they weren't normal dreams. They were too coherent, too structured, too meaningful. In the dreams, I saw the forest from perspectives I'd never experienced. From above, looking down at the canopy. From beneath the soil, sensing the network of roots connecting every tree. From inside the minds of creatures I couldn't name. I saw history. Ancient forests that covered the entire continent. Creatures that no longer existed. And Marcus's people moving through it all like ghosts, guardians of something precious. I woke from these dreams with knowledge I hadn't possessed before. Plant species I shouldn't have recognized, animal behaviors I'd never observed, a sense of the forest as a living system, interconnected in ways that modern science was only beginning to understand. I asked Marcus about the dreams. His reaction confirmed what I'd already suspected. He'd been sharing them with me. Not deliberately at first. The connection had formed naturally, a side effect of our bond. His people communicated partly through something like telepathy. Not mind reading exactly, but the transmission of images, emotions, sensory experiences. Marcus had been unconsciously including me in this communication, and my human brain, desperate to process input it wasn't designed to receive, had converted the transmissions into dreams. When I understood this, I wasn't afraid. I was awed. His people didn't just possess intelligence, they possessed capabilities that humans had never developed. Or perhaps had lost so long ago that we'd forgotten they ever existed. The connection to the forest wasn't metaphorical. It was literal, real. A biological interface with the natural world that allowed them to sense things humans couldn't perceive. And somehow, through Marcus, I was beginning to access it too. Marcus left on a morning in September 1994. I woke to find him standing at the window, watching the sunrise. He'd grown to nearly 7 feet tall. His fur was fully darkened now, the deep brown of mature Sasquatch. He was magnificent. He turned when he heard me stir, crossed the room, sat beside my bed, and he communicated something I'd been expecting for months. It was time. His people were moving. The clan was relocating to territory farther north, deeper into the wilderness. It was a journey they made periodically, following patterns of migration and resource availability that spanned centuries. Marcus had to go with them. I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, to point out everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given, everything we'd built together. But I didn't, because I understood what he was, what he needed, what his people needed from him. Marcus wasn't just any young Sasquatch, he was the offspring of a leader. He carried genetic heritage that his clan valued beyond anything I could comprehend. And he'd spent 5 years learning things no other member of his species knew. Human things, human ways of thinking, human knowledge. He was a bridge, the first in thousands of years, and his people needed him more than I did. We stood outside the cabin together as the sun rose higher. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds, wind, the distant rush of water. Marcus placed his hand on my chest, over my heart. Then he placed his hand on his own chest. Then he extended both hands toward the forest, toward his people waiting in the shadows, family, all of us, connected. "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know." He made a sound, the closest thing to a word he'd ever produced with me. It might have been my name. It might have been Father. I'll never know for certain. Then he turned and walked into the forest. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore, until the shadows swallowed him completely. And I stood there for hours afterward, alone for the first time in 5 years, feeling the silence like a physical weight. The decades that followed were complicated. I tried to resume normal life, sold the property in 1996, moved to Seattle, got remarried, had a daughter, built something that looked like ordinary existence. but I was never ordinary again. The connection Marcus had established didn't disappear when he left. It faded, dimmed to almost nothing, but it never fully severed. I'd still dream sometimes, still sense the forest in ways I couldn't explain, still feel, in rare moments, a presence watching me from impossible distances. I never spoke about Marcus, not to my new wife, not to my daughter, not to anyone who would believe me. I became a nature photographer instead, spent months in wilderness areas, always watching, always hoping. I never saw Marcus again, never found any evidence of his clan, but I knew they were out there. I could feel it. My second marriage ended in 2008. My wife said I was emotionally unavailable. She was right. Part of me had never left that cabin. Never stopped waiting. I moved to a small town in northern Washington, bought property near wilderness, alone again. And I waited. 3 weeks ago, on a morning in late spring, I found the stones. They were arranged outside my front door, 7 of them, placed in a specific pattern that meant something very particular. It was a pattern Marcus had created when he was 4. His first attempt at written communication, he'd arranged stones to represent our cabin, the forest, and the sun. It had taken me weeks to understand what he was trying to convey. Home, safety, light. No one else knew that pattern. No one else could have placed those stones. I stood staring at them for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. Then I looked up at the tree line beyond my property, and I saw him. Not clearly, not fully. Just a shape among the shadows, larger than any human, watching me with a stillness that I recognized instantly. Marcus. After 30 years, Marcus had found me. He came to my cabin that night. I left the door unlocked, left lights on, waited in my chair, afraid to breathe. He had to duck to enter. He was massive now, over 8 feet tall. His fur was streaked with gray, and he moved with the careful deliberation of age. But his eyes were the same. Those amber eyes that had looked at me with terror in that pit, with curiosity in my cabin, with love on the morning he left. He crossed the room, knelt beside my chair, placed his hand on my chest, and the connection exploded back to life. Not dreams this time, not vague impressions, full communication, images and concepts and emotions flooding into my mind with overwhelming intensity. I saw what Marcus had become, a leader like his mother, a bridge between his clan and others scattered across the continent. He'd spent 30 years doing what I'd started, building connections, sharing knowledge, preparing for something. I saw his people, more of them than I'd imagined, thousands maybe, hidden in the deep places of North America, watching, waiting. I saw what they knew about humans, about our history, about what we'd become. And I saw why Marcus had returned. Something was changing. The balance that had kept his people hidden for millennia was shifting. Climate change was destroying their habitat. Human expansion was eliminating the wild places. Technology was making invisibility increasingly impossible. They couldn't hide forever, and they were running out of time. Marcus's people had a choice to make. Reveal themselves and risk everything, or retreat even further and eventually disappear entirely. And they'd sent Marcus to ask for my help. I'm 71 years old. I've lived more of my life without Marcus than with him. But here's what I've learned in the weeks since he returned. His people have been preparing for decades for this moment. They've observed human society, studied our technology, learned our languages through individuals like Marcus who've had contact with humans. They know what we've done to the planet. They know what we've done to other species. They know what we'd probably do to them if they revealed themselves. But they also know something else. The connection they possess, that link to the natural world, isn't just useful, it's necessary. Essential for the survival of ecosystems that humans are systematically destroying. They can communicate with forests, with animal populations, with systems of life that we barely understand. And they're willing to share that knowledge if we're willing to listen. This is what Marcus has asked of me. He wants me to tell this story, to put it out into the world, to prepare people for what's coming. His people are going to reveal themselves, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, carefully, testing whether humans have changed enough in the past 10,000 years to be trusted. They'll start with individuals, people who live in wilderness areas, people who've already had encounters they couldn't explain. They'll build relationships, establish trust, demonstrate that they're not monsters or threats, but a people with knowledge that could help humanity survive what's coming. And they're starting with me, because I already know. I've already been tested. I raised one of them, and I let him go when he needed to leave. I proved 30 years ago that humans can be trusted with this secret. Now it's time to prove that humanity can be trusted with the truth. Marcus is still here, sleeping in my barn like he used to sleep in my cabin. We've fallen back into old patterns with surprising ease, but everything is different now. He's shown me things I never saw before, places in the wilderness where his people gather, evidence of their existence that's been there all along, invisible to eyes that didn't know what to look for. And he's told me about the others, the humans who've had contact over the years, more than I would have guessed. Hundreds of people who've been keeping the same secret I have. We're not alone in this. There's a network already, people who've been trusted, people who've proven themselves. We're the foundation of whatever comes next. I don't know how this story ends. I'm 71 years old. I might have a decade left, maybe less. Whatever happens with Marcus's people, I probably won't see the outcome. But I've been given something I never expected. More time with my son. Because that's what Marcus is. What he's always been. Not biologically, not legally. But in every way that actually matters. I raised him, I taught him, I loved him, and I let him go when he needed freedom more than he needed me. Now he's come back. Not because he needs me anymore, but because his people need what we built together. That bridge between species. That proof of possibility. The forest called him back, and he's calling us forward. I'm going to end this the way I ended every night when Marcus was small. I'd stand at the cabin door, looking out at the darkness, at the trees, at the stars visible through gaps in the canopy. And I'd say the same thing. To Marcus, to myself, to whatever was listening. We're not as different as we think. We're not as alone as we fear. And somewhere out there, in the wild places we've forgotten, something remembers what we used to be. Marcus would make his chirping sound, his way of agreeing. I hear that sound again now, from the barn where he's sleeping. He remembers too. And soon, maybe, the whole world will. This is my story. It's true. Every word. If you're reading this, Marcus's people wanted you to know. They're watching. They're waiting. They're hoping. And the forest is calling all of us back. We just have to be brave enough to answer.